This is the story of 5 men, 5 executioners who served Joseph Stalin and built the deadliest killing machine of the 20th century. They hunted enemies real and imagined. They filled prisons, dug mass graves, and turned fear into a weapon sharper than any bullet. But the machine they created did more than destroy a nation. It devoured its creators, one by one. This is not just history. This is how power consumes the men who wield it. Every dictatorship begins with fear, but the Soviet system began with something worse: panic. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized Petrograd. They promised justice. They delivered chaos. According to historian Orlando Figes, the new government was a tiny island of authority in a sea of anarchy. Railways were breaking. Food was disappearing. Soldiers were deserting. Cities were spiraling into violence. Lenin understood one thing immediately: revolutions don't survive without force. And he had no force, no loyal army, no police, no intelligence service, nothing. So on 7th December 1917, Lenin created something new, something outside the law, something with no limits. The Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. This wasn't a police force. It wasn't a court. It wasn't even a government agency. It was a weapon. And the man placed in charge of this weapon was Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish nobleman turned fanatical revolutionary. A man who had survived prisons, exile, torture, and starvation. A man who believed mercy was betrayal. Historian Robert Conquest describes him simply: driven by ideology, untouched by pity. Under Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka grew with frightening speed. Dozens of agents became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. By early 1918, they had their own prisons, their own courts, their own execution squads. There were rules on paper, but Dzerzhinsky ignored them. The revolution needed enemies, so the Cheka found enemies. Former czarist officers, priests, merchants, workers who complained, peasants who resisted, anyone who questioned Bolshevik power. Arrests spread, interrogations intensified, executions became routine, bodies dumped in rivers, forests, abandoned fields. Then, on the 30th of August 1918, everything changed. Lenin was shot. He survived. But the bullet gave the Bolsheviks the excuse they wanted. Within hours, Dzerzhinsky launched a campaign that became known as the Red Terror. Historian Richard Pipes writes that this moment turned political repression into a system. By the end of 1918, the Cheka operated in every major city. By 1919, it had expanded into the countryside. By 1920, it had become the most feared institution in the Soviet state. Not even the Civil War slowed it down. It thrived in chaos. And as the killing machine grew, so did the man who controlled it. Dzerzhinsky became one of the most powerful figures in Russia, more feared than generals, ministers, or party officials. But Stalin was watching. Quietly, silently, patiently. He was not yet the dictator. But he understood something no one else did. Whoever controlled the secret police would one day control the Soviet Union. The machine had been born, but its true master had not yet claimed it. The Civil War ended in 1921, but the violence didn't. It simply changed shape. The Bolsheviks won the war, but they inherited a starving country collapsing cities, and peasants who no longer trusted the state. The revolution had survived, but only because of the Cheka. Now Lenin wanted something new, not less terror, just cleaner terror. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick writes that by 1922, the regime needed a secret police less chaotic, more organized, and permanently embedded into the government. So, the Cheka was dissolved. On the 6th of February 1922, it was reborn as the GPU. A year later, in November 1923, it became the OGPU, a more legal, more bureaucratic, more disciplined machine of fear. And its new master was a man almost no one outside the party had heard of, Vyacheslav Rudolfovich Menzhinsky. He wasn't a revolutionary hero. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't give speeches. He rarely even left his office. Historian Amy Knight describes him as a man whose silence was more frightening than Dzerzhinsky's passion. Dzerzhinsky still held the title. But by 1924, Menzhinsky was running the day-to-day operations. He worked quietly, methodically, unseen. He didn't need a gun. He had paperwork. Under his direction, the OGPU began building something the Cheka never had: a system. Files, surveillance networks, internal passports, regional informant grids, a national database of socially dangerous elements. This wasn't random terror anymore. This was organized fear. While Dzerzhinsky intimidated people with presence, Menzhinsky intimidated them with process. And the machine grew. The early Gulag camps, Solovki, Kem, Ukhta, expanded rapidly. Prisoners were used for forestry, mining, canal digging. Conditions were lethal. Records were minimal. Historian Anne Applebaum notes, "The Gulag did not begin with Stalin. It began with the OGPU." By 1926, the OGPU had become the spine of the Soviet state. Every factory had informants. Every village had OGPU oversight. Every military unit was monitored. Every conversation could reach the wrong ears. And then, on the 20th of July, 1926, Felix Dzerzhinsky died suddenly after a political argument. The old executioner was gone. The machine needed a new face. Menzhinsky stepped into the top position, but he didn't stand tall. He didn't march through offices with boots and medals. He simply sat in his chair, sick, pale, coughing blood, and tightened the screws on the entire country. Even Stalin noticed his efficiency, and Stalin liked him, because a silent executioner is easier to control than a flamboyant one. But Menzhinsky was not immortal. His health was failing. He ran the OGPU from his leather chair, barely moving. Assistants brought him documents to sign. Some days he was too weak to speak. Yet even dying, he managed the purges of the late 1920s. He oversaw the early stages of forced collectivization. He expanded the Gulag into a nationwide system of slave labor. But the machine he refined would soon be inherited by someone who did not believe in silence. Someone who wanted power, fame, and Stalin's approval. A man waiting behind Menzhinsky's chair, smiling, listening, learning. His name was Genrikh Yagoda, and he would turn the OGPU into an empire of death. When Genrikh Grigorievich Yagoda entered the OGPU's upper ranks in the mid-1920s, he didn't walk, he slithered. Born in 1891, a former metalworker turned radical, he wasn't fierce like Dzerzhinsky, and he wasn't silent like Menzhinsky. He was something else, obedient, ambitious, utterly devoted to Stalin. Historian Oleg Khlevniuk writes that Yagoda thrived in the shadows of stronger men, always watching, always maneuvering, never showing his true face unless it benefited him. When Dzerzhinsky died in 1926 and Menzhinsky was too sick to stand, Stalin needed a man who would not question orders. Yagoda offered something perfect: loyalty without conscience. By 1929, during the chaos of forced collectivization, Yagoda was effectively running the OGPU. Farmers resisting grain seizures were arrested by the thousands. Villages were labeled hostile. Families were deported to the expanding gulag. And in the background, always silent, always calm, was Yagoda, signing orders, approving quotas, expanding camps. It was not personal for him. It was business. Under his guidance, the OGPU created Magnitogorsk, Belomor Canal, Bamlag. Gigantic forced labor projects built with starvation, disease, and death. Historian Anne Applebaum notes that during this period, the Gulag became an economy of corpses. But Stalin was not satisfied. He wanted the OGPU turned into a true political weapon. So, on the 10th of July 1934, the OGPU was absorbed into the new NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and Yagoda became its first chief. Now he controlled the Gulag, the border troops, the secret police, the internal security forces, and the political prisons. He had everything, except Stalin's trust. The mid-1930s were a dangerous time to be powerful in the Soviet Union, because Stalin tolerated no rivals, no independent thinkers, no strong personalities. And Yagoda was becoming too visible. He wore tailored suits. He collected Western art. He lived in luxury, while millions starved. But worse than that, Stalin believed he was too slow, too cautious, too bureaucratic, too refined. The Great Purge required a different kind of monster, and Stalin had already chosen one. In September 1936, without warning, Yagoda was removed from his position. His replacement was a short, nervous, vicious man who worshipped Stalin like a god, Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov. At first, Yagoda thought it was just a demotion. All Soviet officials were reshuffled. He still had influence, still had friends, still had hope. Then people around him began to disappear. Assistants, bodyguards, secretaries, old comrades from the Cheka days. One by one, they vanished into the blackness Yagoda himself had built. Historian Robert Conquest describes Yagoda's paranoia during this period. He understood the system better than anyone, and he knew exactly what was coming. In March 1937, Yagoda was arrested. His house was searched, his diary seized, his art collection confiscated. He was tortured, humiliated, broken. At the 1938 Moscow show trial, he was forced to confess to absurd charges: spying, sabotage, conspiracy. But the most chilling moment came when the prosecutor read the list of crimes committed by the NKVD, and Yagoda realized he was being blamed for everything. Everything he had done for Stalin was now his own death sentence. On the 15th of March, 1938, Genrikh Yagoda was executed with a single bullet, the first fallen executioner of Stalin's killing machine. But the terror did not slow. It accelerated, exploded, turned into something Stalin had never seen before. Because his new executioner was not careful like Yagoda, not bureaucratic like Menzhinsky, not ideological like Dzerzhinsky. He was pure violence, pure loyalty, pure fear. And under his command, the bloodiest year in Soviet history was about to begin. His name was Nikolai Yezhov, and he would drown the country in blood. When Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov took over the NKVD in September 1936, the Soviet Union did not know his name. They would learn it in screams. Yezhov was small, barely 5 feet tall, sickly, anxious, constantly trembling. But behind his nervous smile was something far more dangerous than ambition: fanaticism. Historian Oleg Khlevniuk writes that Stalin chose Yezhov because he was the perfect instrument, loyal, cruel, and willing to destroy anyone. Within weeks of taking office, Yezhov transformed the NKVD from Yagoda's bureaucratic machine into a weapon of mass murder. The Great Terror began, not slowly, not cautiously, but like an explosion. On the 30th of July 1937, Yezhov signed NKVD Order 447, the most deadly document in Soviet history. It created arrest quotas for every region, quotas for executions, quotas for camp sentences. Your fate wasn't based on guilt, it was based on numbers. Historian Robert Conquest, in The Great Terror, calls it industrialized repression. Whole categories of people were marked for extinction. Former nobles, priests, officers, kulaks, national minorities, anyone with a foreign-sounding name, anyone with a suspicion, anyone who had known anyone now considered an enemy. Once the quotas were filled, Moscow demanded more. Cities worked overtime, not to produce goods, but to produce confessions. Torture chambers operated day and night. Interrogators slept on the floor between sessions. The NKVD used beatings, broken bones, sleep deprivation, starvation, and threats against family members. Thousands of people begged to die. In just 15 months, Yezhov ordered the arrest of 1.5 million people. At least 681,000 were executed, shot in the back of the head. Historian Applebaum writes, "This was not law enforcement, it was annihilation." Yezhov personally reviewed execution lists late into the night. He drank heavily. He laughed at confessions. He demanded faster results. If regional officials hesitated, Yezhov accused them of treason and added their names to the lists. No one was safe. The army lost half its officers. Engineers, writers, scientists, teachers, shot for imaginary conspiracies. Families vanished. Entire villages emptied. And the Gulag expanded again. Kolyma, Vorkuta, Norilsk, frozen hells built by those Yezhov condemned. The Soviet Union became a country of whispers, fear, and midnight knocks. By late 1938, something shifted. Stalin was satisfied. The elite had been purged. The army was crippled. The population was terrorized. Now Yezhov was no longer useful. Historian Simon Sebag Montefiore notes that Stalin began calling him that little bloodsucker, and Yezhov felt it. His hands shook more. He drank more. He begged Stalin for affection in letters that looked like the writings of a frightened child. But Stalin had already chosen his next executioner, Lavrenti Beria, a cold, calculating Georgian who despised Yezhov and coveted his position. In November 1938, Yezhov was quietly removed as NKVD chief. He was told to rest, to stay home, to remain calm. Then his guards were replaced. His phone stopped ringing. His friends disappeared. On the 10th of April, 1939, he was arrested. During interrogation, he begged for mercy. He confessed to anything they wanted. He even tried to kill himself, unsuccessfully. By the time he was put on trial in February 1940, Yezhov was a broken man, sobbing uncontrollably. He was executed on the 4th of February, 1940. The blood dwarf had drowned an empire in terror, but the machine he unleashed consumed him whole. In the aftermath, Soviet citizens invented a phrase, Yezhovshchina, the time of Yezhov, a time of fear, silence, and mass graves, a time when Stalin's killing machine reached its full capacity. But now, the machine needed a new master, not a fanatic, not a nervous wreck, a strategist, a manipulator, a predator, someone who understood power the way Stalin did, someone who could rebuild the NKVD and turn it into something even more efficient, someone far more dangerous. Lavrenti Beria, the final executioner and the most terrifying of them all. When Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria entered the NKVD headquarters in late 1938, the building still smelled of Yezhov's terror. Blood on the walls, files stacked like tombstones, interrogation rooms echoing with screams that had not yet faded. Beria walked through it all calmly, smiling. Historian Simon Sebag Montefiore describes him as a brilliant, sadistic manipulator, the most dangerous man Stalin ever employed. He was not a fanatic like Yezhov, not a zealot like Dzerzhinsky, not a bureaucrat like Yagoda. Beria was something far worse, a predator with patience. When Stalin appointed Beria as NKVD chief on the 25th of November, 1938, the Great Terror was ending. The Soviet elite was destroyed. The nation was exhausted. But Stalin did not want less power. He wanted cleaner control. Beria offered exactly that. His first act was unexpected. He stopped the mass executions, closed some torture chambers, executed many of Yezhov's interrogators. He wasn't merciful. He was strategic. He understood what Stalin needed next, a stable, efficient terror, not a chaotic, uncontrollable slaughter. Historian Oleg Khlevniuk writes, Beria's genius was his ability to make terror systematic again. Under Beria, the NKVD became an intelligence empire. He reorganized it with military precision. Informant networks were strengthened. Surveillance deepened. The Gulag expanded into a vast industrial colony. Everything was recorded, measured, filed. Fear became administration. From 1939 to 1945, the Gulag population exploded past 2 million prisoners. The camps built gold mines, industrial plants, railroads, military factories, and the famous Moscow-Volga Canal. Slave labor became state policy. Historian Applebaum notes that Beria turned the Gulag from a punishment system into an economic engine powered by human misery. Prisoners died by the tens of thousands each winter. Work quotas increased. Food rations were cut. Executions continued. Not public, not loud, but constant. The killing machine no longer screamed, it hummed. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin trusted only one man to secure the home front: Beria. He oversaw mass evacuations, spy networks, military counterintelligence, and the brutal treatment of unreliable ethnic groups. In 1944, under Beria's orders, entire nationalities were deported in days: Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Meskhetian Turks, Karachay, Balkars. Families were loaded into cattle cars, sent to Siberia and Central Asia. Thousands died on the journey. Historian Robert Conquest wrote, "Beria turned deportation into a weapon of ethnic cleansing." During the war, he rose even higher. By 1945, he sat on the State Defense Committee, the inner circle of Stalin's empire. He controlled the secret police, the Gulag, the atomic bomb project, and every intelligence operation. He was no longer just an executioner. He was a rival in the making. Behind closed doors, Beria was even more monstrous. He used his position to abduct young women from Moscow. Some were released. Some disappeared forever. Records, testimonies, and historians like Amy Knight confirm the pattern. Beria used a state car and security detail to hunt victims at night. It wasn't political. It was personal. A private kingdom of terror inside the public one. People whispered a single sentence in Moscow: "If Beria's car stops for you, you will not return." By the late 1940s, Stalin was aging, paranoid, suspicious of everyone except Beria. He still trusted him, still relied on him, still believed only Beria could manage the empire of fear. But Beria made a fatal mistake. He began to believe he could outlive Stalin. He began placing loyalists in key ministries. He began controlling more intelligence. He began building a power base independent of the dictator. And then, on the 5th of March, 1953, Stalin died. The Soviet Union shook. Ministers panicked. The future was uncertain. And Beria moved faster than anyone else. He freed prisoners to gain public support. He pushed reforms to win allies in the government. He acted like the new master of the state. For a moment, it looked like he might succeed. But the machine he helped build, the machine of fear, suspicion, and betrayal, was about to turn on him too. Because powerful men do not tolerate rivals. And Beria had become the most powerful man of all. He had survived Stalin. But he would not survive Stalin's heirs. On the night of the 5th of March, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The man who fed the machine was gone. But the machine still stood. And Beria believed it now belonged to him. For 10 years, he had been Stalin's shadow, Stalin's enforcer, Stalin's spider. And now, for the first time in his life, he tasted the air of possibility. According to historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, Beria whispered to a colleague after Stalin's death, "Now everything is mine." He wasn't exaggerating. Within 48 hours, Beria moved with breathtaking speed. He released thousands of political prisoners, not out of mercy, but to portray himself as a reformer. He took control of the security services again. He promoted loyal officers. He ordered surveillance on rivals. He dominated every meeting of the new leadership. The Presidium, Malenkov, Molotov, Khrushchev, feared him more than they feared one another. Historian Amy Knight writes, Beria acted as if the Soviet Union already belonged to him. He controlled the police. He controlled the intelligence. He controlled the files. He had enough dirt to destroy all of them, and they knew it. In June 1953, a quiet alliance formed. Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Defense Minister Georgy Zhukov, the hero of World War II, agreed on one thing. Beria must die. Not demoted, not isolated, not exiled. Eliminated, because as long as Beria breathed, none of them were safe. On 26 June 1953, during a Presidium meeting, Khrushchev opened the attack. He accused Beria of treason, of plotting to divide the USSR, of spying for Britain. Lies? Probably, but it didn't matter. Beria stood to speak, but the doors burst open. Marshal Zhukov marched in with armed soldiers. Beria's face drained of color. This was the moment he had created for countless victims. Now it was his turn. According to historian Oleg Khlevniuk, Beria screamed as the soldiers seized him. "Comrades! Comrades! What are you doing?" The spider begged, cried, pleaded. The same man who had ordered the torture of thousands fell to his knees on the Kremlin carpet. It didn't matter. He was dragged away. For the next 6 months, Beria was held in an underground bunker. He was interrogated, beaten, humiliated. His loyal officers were arrested, his networks dismantled, his files seized. Historian Robert Conquest notes that Beria's interrogations revealed something rare. A man who could terrify millions, but collapse instantly when isolated. He confessed to everything they accused him of: spying, treason, sexual assault, conspiracy. Truth and lies blended together. It no longer mattered. The machine he had perfected was now grinding him to dust. On the 23rd of December, 1953, Beria was placed before a special tribunal. No lawyers, no appeals, no delays. He didn't stand like a statesman. He trembled. He sobbed. He begged for his life. The verdict was decided before he entered the room. Death. Within minutes, soldiers marched him into a small basement chamber. He tried to speak one last time, but the commander lifted a pistol. A single shot ended the life of the most feared executioner in Soviet history. Beria died the way hundreds of thousands had died under him, shot in the back of the head, alone, in a concrete room. The fall of Beria marked the end of Stalin's killing machine. The Cheka, the OGPU, the NKVD. 3 decades of terror had built the Soviet state, and then devoured the men who built it. Dzerzhinsky died exhausted. Menzhinsky died sick and haunted. Yagoda was executed. Yezhov was tortured and executed. And now Beria, the spider, was hunted and killed like vermin. 5 men. 5 architects of death. 5 lives swallowed by the very thing they created. This is the story of 5 men who believed they could use fear to shape a nation. But fear has no master. It only has victims. And in the end, the killing machine they built claimed them all. The Soviet Union rose on their violence, but it also cracked under their shadow. Because when a state builds its power on terror, it does not create strength. It creates ghosts, millions of them. And ghosts do not stay buried, not in history, not in memory, not in nations that still carry their scars.